So I thought perhaps we'd start by thinking about the Man Booker International Prize and literary prizes in general this year. The prize was won by Han Kang, of course, for The Vegetarian, translated by Deborah Smith. I wonder how you feel about the importance of literary prizes in terms of disseminating literature globally.
I will start. I kind of caught Amy's eye for like half a second then, so I feel I have to say something now. Literary prizes, obviously, they vary enormously in what they're trying to do and in the success with which they achieve that. The Man Booker International is one of the successful ones, partly because it has this enormous name, the Booker name, which is a kind of it has a kind of prestige of its own in the UK and around the English-speaking world. And because it has this big name, it has a lot of publicity. Part of the problem we have, I think, in the UK is that we have probably got too many literary prizes in general. And as a result, they're competing for the same amount of oxygen, the same amount of kind of publicity. And for prizes to be valuable, especially when it's the kind of prize that's attempting to introduce new writers, so international writing in the UK, it depends, I think, on being able to get the kind of attention in the press, which doesn't always happen. The Man Booker International is sort of a replacement to a prize called the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize, which ran for about 20 years. And in almost every respect, those two prizes are the same. They were structured the same and judged in the same way, and the criteria were the same way. The difference between the two was the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize got almost no publicity, and the Man Booker Prize got a huge amount of publicity, and that has made it an enormously successful and I think very influential prize in a way that its predecessor always struggled to be.
I think, can you hear me on this? Is it audible? Okay. Louder. Okay. I certainly think the Man Booker International Prize is a very worthy prize, as is the Booker Prize. And especially looking at it from the vantage of India, being an Indian writer and an editor, a books editor, literary editor at a magazine. The Man Booker International Prize, because it's associated with the Booker tag, and because the Booker Prize has a certain history and it's taken very, very seriously in India. The minute the Booker shortlist is released, we're all dutifully buying all the books, and British Council is holding discussions of the shortlist and they're being reviewed widely. So Booker has a very, very big following, and because the Man Booker International has the same tag and is being given by the same group, there's an associated excitement over that prize. And of course, in Profile, it's a very different prize. It's awarding all the works of a writer, not just that one book. And that writing could be in any language, as against the Booker Prize. So I think, from the perspective of India, it's a very curious phenomenon when anyone from the subcontinent is shortlisted, because you might have a writer. I know, for instance, that the state of India that I live in, Karnataka, has a very, very well-known writer called U.R. Ananthamurthy. And he died a couple of years ago, but he was, really the best-known writer in the language and the state. But I'm not so sure how well-known he is in the rest of India. Now, if he's shortlisted for the Man Booker International through a very circuitous, strange, obviously post-colonial route, suddenly he's better known in the rest of the country. The same thing happened with a Pakistani writer, Intizar Hussain, who was shortlisted. I don't know if he was shortlisted. I think he was shortlisted. He didn't win the prize, but he was shortlisted. Intizar Hussain, again, very well-known person in Urdu letters, has been translated, well-known among people who follow Urdu literature, not necessarily well-known by people who read
perfect.
literature, but in translation. So I think the prize is performing an interesting service that way, but it's just one prize. And I really think, much as I admire what the prize is doing, I think we need more ways in India and in the subcontinent to access these writers much more directly. And I could go on about this because it's a theme that I constantly think about, which is what are the ways outside the Anglo-American publishing prize-giving industry for us to access our own writers?
Yeah, and I want to speak for myself and
the missing chair today. So about Arabic literature prizes, just briefly. And historically, Arabic literary prizes have been probably at least as harmful as they have been helpful associated with the government. The Arabic Booker, which is what it's called in Arabic, although they insist that they're called the International Prize for Arabic Fiction, has been a new movement, and it's now in its 8th or ish year. Although it still has been prey to some political winds about what makes a good novel, what makes a real novel, what are we looking for in terms of form and topicality there, and so I guess in Arabic there have been some positive parts of prizes in that distribution is such a huge problem. It's hard to know, it's really difficult to know from outside a publisher in New York or London what's going on in Arabic fiction. It's also very hard to know for an Arabic speaker in Morocco or Oman or Beirut what's going on not within 5 kilometers of their own house. So the International Prize for Arabic Fiction is sort of the one way to get a book out to a wider audience. Also, and then for children's literature, just 3 years old now, the Etisalat Prize for Arabic Children's Literature. Although I was just talking to Rania Amin, who won the YA prize for it this year, 2 weeks ago. And she felt that part of the problem was with YA literature is that people are writing directly for the prize rather than writing for kids. So this is an element of
like an Oscars performance.
Right.
I suppose the best joke about prizes was from Kingsley Amis, who said that literary prizes are rubbish, and that's of course you win them. I think Marsh made a good point about writing for a prize as opposed to writing directly to the reader. It's like a chef who wants to get a Michelin star or 3 as opposed to just creating a good meal. I think prizes are useful in attracting a certain amount of attention so that each book gets a little gold star it can wear and attract attention from an audience. But for me, when I was speaking as a critic, I find that the fact that a book has won a prize is useful in that it means I don't have to pay attention to it now because it has had attention paid to it. I like to think of my job as trying to occasionally bring out books which have slipped underneath this particular net. So, and also I know many people who've been Booker judges. I thank Providence that I have not been asked to do this job myself yet, and I would probably turn it down if I were asked. The work that's involved is incredible, and very often you end up having a compromise decision, which does not necessarily, which only means that all the judges can agree on one thing, which means that they're picking a book they dislike the least, which isn't necessarily the same thing as the best book. So I am very ambivalent about prizes. They are both, a good thing. It's lovely to see a good book wins a prize and deserves to win it. And yet, but then again, nothing's perfect. It's got lumps in it, but it's. So I'm afraid that's a rather ambivalent answer.
I wonder if there's something about a kind of levelling or a kind of conformity, an expectation of what a prize-winning book should look like, and that idea that literary fiction is in some way not a genre when in fact perhaps it is. Maybe that's got something to do with it. Marcy, I was very interested to read a piece that you wrote on a new Arabic prize for short story collections. And I wondered if we could talk about form and the reason that the novel is still the kind of monument to which we all aspire, and other forms might be made available through a global context.
Right, yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I was at a conference fairly recently where there was this big debate about what is the first Arabic novel. Is Shujai's Leg Over Leg the first Arabic novel? Is it Zainab? No, of course it's not Zainab in 1919, but the anxiety about this what is the first Arabic novel? Is it as if Arabic literature began when the novel began? And this is what the big emphasis on prizes in translation has been from Arabic, has been the novel, and a novel that is easily consumable and easily understandable belongs to this kind of global or Western trajectory. Whereas there's, so much else vibrant going on with Arabic literature. So I think this short story prize, hopefully, it is, the first one is yet to be awarded. It'll be awarded next month. So hopefully this will bring out other things that are happening in Arabic literature that we don't see, or sometimes there are many things published in translation, of course, that, we talk about them being printed and published, that 30 people read. So there are these different forms and other things going on that don't make this.
One of the things that determines whether, there are many things that determine whether a book is successful in a different culture, but one of them is the extent to which it fits in to that culture's idea of what makes a good novel, which is not going to be the same everywhere. I am, in fact, judging the International Booker at the moment, and all the things Nick says are, of course, completely true. And there's a lot of work, and I shouldn't complain because I just get to read books, but nonetheless. But one of the things that we keep talking about is we have 124 novels to read, and they're translated from I don't know how many languages. And there's a question about whether, when you're comparing a novel that was originally written in Arabic, a novel that's originally written in Chinese, a novel that was originally written in Hebrew or Polish or French, when we're trying to look for one thing that defines the success of this, is it fair, is it reasonable? When the traditions are different, when the aims are different, when the influences are different, when some of them will be from cultures that have very strong poetic backgrounds, that have very strong short form backgrounds, countries that have very different editing traditions as well. And we end up trying to find a way of finding something that by some more or less arbitrary measure, not entirely but almost arbitrary measure,
You also
fits.
have to bear in mind the competence of the translator of each book as well, and that's a huge variable.
Perhaps we could talk a bit more about the importance of translation.
Yeah, and I think before we come to translation, I think what Daniel's point also brings out is the vagaries of publication, because the prize, the Man Booker International Prize, is a small example of trying to introduce some kind of a leveling element into a very, very variable field. But before that, you have all these books that are presumably all in English, right? They have all at some point been translated into English. And if you trace them back to their points of origins, I think you'll probably find that it's usually the Anglo-American publishing industry that is publishing translations of what is the theme of this panel, which is world literature. And extending the publishing of translations into English beyond Britain and America, into countries I think like India could be very interesting. I mean, we don't do it very much so far, partly because the resources are limited and partly because we ourselves write in so many languages and we're translating each other and ourselves. But it's still a very curious experience to, for instance, try and find out something about Chinese literature and look around at what is available in translation and find that everything that is available is coming from very far away. And so what would it be like if we made the choices and made the selections to translate our neighbors ourselves? Would it be exactly the same? Would we still be translating Mo Yan, and would we still be translating the other Chinese writers who have been very successful lately? And I think culture does play a role here, and it may actually be very different. So it's also a question of the point that Daniel made earlier, like you are bringing your own cultural preferences to what you translate and what you consider valuable as literature. So I think not just the business of translation, but also before that, what you choose to publish of another language.
And what you're describing, in fact, about a country like India, for example, depending on the translation that's happening in other places, the converse is also true. But one of the problems we have, if you look at what's published in translation in the UK and the US, in Ireland and Canada, and various other countries, we're translating more and more contemporary literature, but it's still coming from a very small number of places. And what you're not seeing, for example, is writing from India, writing from Bangladesh, translated into English, published in the rest of the English-speaking world outside the subcontinent. So there are lots of Indian writers who are being translated here, lots of Bangladeshi writers being translated here, who don't have a presence in the books we're reading for the Booker at the moment. We have more or less the same number of books translated from the Netherlands as we have translated from Asia. Asia's quite a lot bigger than the Netherlands. Population-wise, the Netherlands is about 20 million people, I think, and Asia's 4.5 million. This is not because there aren't any good writers, it's because, for reasons of economics and for various other reasons, these writers are being published, but they're being published domestically, they're being translated domestically. And an Indian writer being published by HarperCollins India or Penguin India or whoever it is, actually still has far too little chance of being read by people in the UK and the US, Canada, Ireland.
But to sort of play the devil's advocate, why do we need that? Why should an Indian writer who writes in an Indian language and is translated here also be recognized internationally? From a practical point of view, the answer to that would be so that he or she is read more in India. If he or she wins the Man Booker International, like the examples I gave at the beginning, it will have a sort of reflected effect, a reflected glory in India, and that person, writer, will be read more. But otherwise, from a strictly literary point of view, why this concern with the global, with a writer who's operating in a language which is one of, say, India's several dozen languages? Should that writer also be somebody you're reading when you're judging the Man Booker Prize?
I think it goes to the heart of this subtitle, Hidden Realities. I think it's a question of what is being hidden from whom, and what is literature for in that kind of global context.
I mean, the point of literature, as I say, is
what is it? What is the point of literature?
The point of literature I'm about to tell you, it's in order to make different reality, to expose the reader to different reality, to different experiences, to put yourself into the state of mind of someone who is not you and comes from somewhere, can come from somewhere completely different. So in a way, we should be paying more attention, especially in the Anglophone world, which is it's quite parochial in its way. The number of books that come into Great Britain and America is pathetic when compared to the number of books that are translated into, say, the European languages. So literature is already global. In fact, there should be, well, not a duty, because that would stop it from being fun, but it should be an enormous compulsory pleasure to read books from the opposite side of the world where you live.
I wanted to build on something that you were saying, that one of the features and problematics of translation is, as it's currently practiced, is that literature often has to go through New York and London in order to be so what's translated into Urdu, for instance, is often the book that's been selected in English as meaningful, rather than going straight from Arabic to Urdu, as it did more historically. So English becomes a kind of a filter globally for what kind of translations are available.
And it's also curious about, I think it is a little curious, the language we use to talk about world literature, because you're saying that it is important, and I agree, that one should read books and literatures from cultures that are distant or that are foreign. But in this case, the foreign is always not the English or not the American.
Yes.
English and American is not foreign to anyone. So that's not the problem. So it creates this sort of curious model of the center and the periphery, and we're always trying to bring the periphery to the center. And again, why? I mean, are there ways to try and counter that sort of direction?
I completely agree. And actually, as a writer of fiction, of novels, and an English writer, a British writer of fiction, for me, what's really exciting about that exposure is thinking about how it might change my practice. So in the UK, we recognise the short story as single short stories. I don't think I've ever heard of someone thinking about the collection as a form in itself. The Han Kang novel was originally published as 3 separate novellas and then united into a novel, and for me that's very interesting, thinking about the way that I write. So it shouldn't be this unidirectional descent of Ruby. I completely agree with you. I think it's a really problematic thing to think in that terms.
But then what are the answers to your question about why should people here care about readers there? One of the answers is because some of the readers there are also writers, and what is happening is writers influencing other writers. There was an interview in I think it was in the Dhaka Tribune today, with someone who's launching a young adult novel here in a few days' time, and he's talking about his influences. And his influences are, if I remember rightly, all English language writers in the UK and the US. It's inconceivable that that would happen the other way around, that you'd find a debut English language young adult writer who would be able to talk about great writers who are writing in Bangla, great writers who are writing in Urdu, great writers who are influencing them. And I think that's one of the reasons why the travel beyond our own communities is important, not just for, as it were, ordinary readers, but actually because that's how literature itself, that's how writers themselves get refreshed.
What would it take for that to happen? Because I think what's happening now is that you're reading it as a foreign literature. You're not reading it as literature per se, which is what we've been doing all these decades. We have not necessarily read it as a foreign literature. And that's partly because of our education, partly because of colonialism. Do you think there's a situation now in the UK or in America where you're just reading this as literature and you're not saying, okay, now I'm reading necessarily a Man Booker International Prize novel or a foreign novel?
I think it's happening more. I think it's getting better, but I think there is still a problem that Marcia alluded to, which is about how the decisions are made about what to publish. And there is still a sense among certain publishing houses and certain publishing decisions that if they're going to publish a book that's translated from somewhere else, its function has to be anthropological. So you're really reading this to find out what it's like being a woman in this country, a man in this country, a labourer in that country, rather than people who are crafting stories, people who are using language and so forth. I think it's getting better, and interestingly in the UK at least, one of the ways it's getting better is things like translated crime fiction, which is read like crime fiction. It's not read like related fiction. No one reads Scandinavian crime novels differently to Scottish crime novels. They don't buy them differently. The sales are dramatically higher than other translated fiction. And we kind of, in that area, and a small number of other areas, we managed to get past the idea that in a way, the translatedness is what's interesting about it. And actually, in this case, it's plot, and it's character, and it's language, and it's structure, and it's all those other things. And you measure it in the same way that you measure your reading experience of any other kind of book.
Yes, I think I'd agree with that. I think the reason that the Han Kang novel was celebrated was for its formal and stylistic qualities, rather than as this kind of exoticist insight into being Korean. I don't think that was what was of interest. Perhaps a bit of both, yes. Do you think that there are sort of trends that you can see globally across fiction? It seems to me to be almost impossible to talk about a global fiction as if it's all one thing, but are there kind of contemporary preoccupations that you think transcend location? I notice a lot of attention to kind of urban landscapes, for example, seems to be something that writers are interested in the changing experience of living in a city. Whether that connects to global connectedness, I suppose.
I don't know. I've read quite a few novels recently written, which are set in rural communities. So, but
is
maybe
there anything?
there's just luck of the draw. And, no, so I've answered your question just to show that I can't answer it. Sorry about that.
Well, I wonder if the very genre of the novel is getting a bit blurred, and whether that's a good thing. Because I think with, on the one hand, a novel like, say, Teju Cole's Open City, which is not unique, which takes the form of the narrator telling a story which in large respects is similar to his own life, but is described as a novel. It's not entirely new. V.S. Naipaul did it with Enigma of Arrival. There are older examples, but there seems to be with W.G. Sebald and and Knausgaard, who also describes his work as fiction, this sort of blurring between the autobiographical and the fictional, and I think it's partly because the nature of the experiences being described are unique, I think. And they don't necessarily fit available fictional forms with sort of the traditional novel of a person describing a very rooted reality. They're sort of inventing the reality that they're describing. So I'm just curious about that. I don't know if that's a very developed form yet in Indian literature. I'm not sure, but I can see that happening elsewhere, and I'm just wondering what everyone else thinks about this sort of blurring that's happening.
Well, I wonder whether one of the answers is to do with what we were talking about before in terms of what is travelling and what isn't. And one of the ways, it's very hard to see trends because we all have only the perspectives of where we are. We can see what is making it into English and what is making it into whichever language. But I wonder whether one of the ways of tracking the trends is seeing who the writers are who are being read. And if there is a change in the kind of way that people, is happening in lots of countries in Europe, are writing this sort of auto-fiction thing, whether that's partly connected to the fact that Knausgaard is selling, whether the fact that Sebald has been read very widely by writers in lots of places, that those things kind of make the trends in a way that is partly to do with the kind of global movement of books. I suspect if you looked at trends in children's writing, a huge amount of what's happened in the last 20 years has been to do with a small number of books, including the Harry Potter books, which are about to turn 20, which is a terrifying thought for those of us who are older than 20. But I think a lot of things that look like trends are basically responses to some of the books that just happen to have sold well, happen to have sold, been read very widely, culturally widely.
I'd like to think they're profound cultural reasons, but you may well be right. It may well just...
Well, it's like the Amazon algorithm. If you like this, you will like this. So, yeah, I know.
I did get a book from a publisher recently, a press copy, and on the back it said, for fans of Elena Ferrante, Hermann Koch, and Karl Ove Knausgaard, who have nothing in common, except that they're all foreign writers who are
There was this
translated.
curious assumption about Elena Ferrante that she was the female Knausgaard and that she was writing this autofic, when in fact we didn't know what the auto bit was until
That's what
recently.
people want to believe, I think.
I mean, one of the things, I teach students as my other part of my job, and they're sort of obsessed with realism and things feeling real or being authentic, and I wonder if that leads us to believe that it comes from something personal.
Well, it made me think of the first popular foreign language successes for a while were the magical realists, which is not really realism at all. That seemed to be a way to have something exotic, both narratively exotic as well as coming from another place. So maybe your students are picking up the one in the stick.
They hate all that. They hate anything that's difficult or experimental these days.
Yeah. Oh, well.
From sort of arguing from the other end, I also wonder if novelists just don't have that grand cultural confidence anymore to describe reality in this sort of, you know, where the novel sort of embodies it, and you can be a Tolstoy sort of talking almost from the point of view of the landscape and then coming to the characters and then coming to the dynamism between, I mean, sort of just a whole reality in language. And we're living in a much more fragmented, much more, I don't know, diverse world, all of us. And so we're withdrawing more and more to our own experiences. And if that could be one reason why we're writing more from our own points of view.
Do you want to ask a question? Sorry.
I was just going to say that the way we think about realism is also culturally determined to a great extent, and the extent to which a book is supposed to, a piece of writing is supposed to be authentic authentically, for want of a better word, representing the reality that a writer experiences, because people like Garcia Marquez talked about his work as being truthful, about being about the real world. I recently interviewed Raja Allen, who was one of the winners of the Arabic event last year, I think, or 2 years ago. 3 years ago even, with a book just set in Mecca. It's an extraordinary book, but she talks about it as a way of talking about her experience of the real world. It's not something which I read in any way with any sense that it was about reality as a realist novel, a real meta, but there's something about it, about the thing that she was trying to say about this place, and her experience of this place, and her memories of this place. She talked about it as though she were talking about realism.
I think that comes back to what you were saying about the idea of judging these works which come from multiple and diverse cultures which have been translated into one language and judging them by the same criteria.
I think this Russia's book makes it very difficult into English because she is dealing with this very kind of small story tradition rather than there's, I don't know what you would mark as the beginning and end of Russia's book. It's so much stuff, and science stuff. But I think it's fantastic that some people are taking the time to read it in English, even though it is very difficult.
I think we'd like to aim to end the session shortly before the hour is up, as it were, to try and catch us up on time. But if anybody in the audience would have any questions for our panel, then please make yourselves known, this gentleman.
I'm Mohammad Noor Shakar. I'm somewhat like a poet. I had an opportunity of attending 3 of the largest conventions of the poets of the world in the United States of America. In 1989, I attended one of the largest conventions of poets of the world called the World of Poetry in Las Vegas, Nevada, USA. In 1989, I was the only Bangladeshi poet who had an opportunity of attending the largest convention of poets around the world, which was held in San Francisco, USA, organized by the American Poetry Association. And thirdly, in 1991, I attended one of the largest poets convention organized by the American Poets Association. In the light of in the light of what all of you said, I remember a poem written by one of the finest romantic poets called Ode to a Nightingale. One midnight, John Keats was thrilled with the music produced by the Nightingale. Let's assume that there were dozens of people living in England at the time that experienced the same song at the same time. Let's assume that all of them, including the poet, romantic John Keats, were thrilled equally at the same time. What was the fundamental difference between John Keats, the romantic poet, and all other people for whom English was the first language? They felt the same way, they were moved within the same way, and still there was a difference between John Keats, the creative genius, and the other average people of England at the time. All the other people went back home in their own ways, and John Keats took up the responsibility of shaping the raw materials of his experiences into a great piece of art, a romantic poem that ranks with all the best poems written in any language of the world. The question is, did all of you or any of you write whatever you wrote so far, did write based on your real life experiences, or you simply wrote something that was absolutely products of your own imagination?
It's quite easy for me to answer that question because mostly I'm a translator, which means I write things based on other people's real life experiences. They pretend, obviously, to be making it up. I don't have to pretend quite so much.
Is there another question from the audience? Yes, madam. Do we have a... People who would like to ask questions.
Ma'am, you were talking about English acting as a filter for different literatures. You're saying that we don't see much translation from Chinese to Urdu, for example. It sounded almost like a complaint that the English-speaking people consider other literature as foreign, whereas we read English as literature. But don't you think that if the filter of English was not there, it would be even more difficult for us to communicate? I mean, how do you think we can increase communication between different literatures in different areas of India, for example? Forget about the world. I mean, English is not foreign to me, but Tamil is definitely foreign to me. It sounds weird, but it's true. How forget about the rest of the world, but how do we escape English and communicate more amongst ourselves? I have never read a novel that has been translated directly from Tamil into Bangla. How do we communicate amongst ourselves without English? Forget about the world.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't think it's about escaping English, which I think is very hard to do, even if we wanted to. But I think, I mean, even if we remain with English, for the sake of the argument, and say, given that we have a fairly large population of readers in English in the Indian subcontinent, why are we not ourselves translating more literature from the neighborhood into English, rather than relying on publishers from the West? Why don't we choose, for instance, what we would like to read of Chinese literature and translate it into English? So I'm not being anti-English here. I'm saying why don't we claim English much more sort of robustly in a way, given that we do have an industry of English language publishing. And to be fair, there is in the Indian publishing industry, you can now read Bangladeshi writers in English, Pakistani writers in English, Sri Lankan writers in English. So there is stuff coming in that is not only Indian, but it isn't in translation, right? It's written originally in English. But having said that, I think we also need a shift in imagination, which would allow us to learn Tamil, or allow us to learn Marathi, or allow us to learn Gujarati and translate between the languages. Why does it seem such an impediment? And why does it seem as if English should sort of take over that whole space? It needn't be, right? English can exist alongside these languages, and we could translate if we make the moves to learn those languages. We could start translating between them. It's not impossible. I mean, we're sitting here, we have 2 translators working in multiple languages alongside English, right? So why not the same for the languages of the subcontinent without English?
I suppose that there has to be one language which everyone can use. Historically, the historical accident is that it's English. It is a lingua franca, but so while I complain about the insularity of the English, it does mean that a great many literatures are suddenly available to a global audience, which would not necessarily be the case otherwise. So while I can complain about English parochialism or something, it's also responsible for much that is good. But I suppose I'm only repeating your original point.
Thank you. Sorry, do you want to say something? A mic. Oh, sorry.
Or my question to the all the parents is that it is not a disgrace that to give a Nobel Literature Prize a songwriter it indicate that the era of fiction is the ending, or my second question is, it is the hidden reality of the fiction is that publishing of more books, but readers is decreasing.
So the second question was, there are more books but less readers, is that right? Do you have a view on that?
I can translate.
Ah, okay, giving the bell to the songwriter. Okay, yes.
Yes, it's about, I think it's the health of fiction, whether the Nobel to Dylan is evidence that somehow fiction is at threat. It's hard to know with readers. Certainly we have no shortage of people who want to write fiction. That may be the problem, but we have more and more people wanting to write the stuff. And we're actually publishing, certainly in English, we're publishing more and more fiction. We're publishing more fiction than we ever have done. We're not selling it as well as we would like. I think it's quite hard to take one example of one prize and extrapolate from that an indication of the state of literature in the world, any more than if the Nobel had gone to someone else who would suddenly think that it's all about poetry or all about short stories or whatever. I don't know whether... the state of fiction doesn't worry me, the state of fiction in the world. You can't move for the stuff at the moment.
I recommend you come to the death of literature later today. It may answer your question. Do we have another question? I don't know where the mic is. Maybe this lady there? Easy transfer.
Hello. So you guys were talking about realism, and I was wondering, there's a rise in fiction when it comes to naturalism, which is a more pessimistic version of realism. And there's an absence of spirituality, absence of religious influence, just very raw feelings out there. So I'm just wondering, how is that affecting translation studies?
Thank you, that's a very good question. The rise of nationalism.
Is it perhaps too soon to tell yet? It's only really started getting bad this year. So maybe it's all in the pipeline. And I think what we might be seeing from Writers' Grove is, in fact, a revulsion against this kind of thing. So it might actually, what's bad for the world might actually be good for fiction.
I think it might relate back to what you were saying earlier, Ajahn, about the form of the novel and the realist novel particularly, which has historically always been associated with a construction of nationhood, and maybe it's encouraging to see that people are trying to break those forms apart in some way and find ways around that unitary view. Should we have one more question, do you think? One last question, please. This gentleman down here had his hand up all the time. We could get a mic to him. Thank you.
Well, it's a question to Daniel, more or less, because you were talking about Man Booker Prize, and you go through so many fiction to choose from. I just wonder that sometimes, you get novels written in English, but could it be that you find that some of this English, which comes from, say, subcontinent, is it special? How do you judge that? Because if it is called subcontinental English, then do you convert it into your own way of thinking, and then when you consider for prizes?
The Man Booker International is it's for a book translated into English published in the UK. That doesn't mean that the translator has to be British. Actually, there are lots of translators who are not writers of British English principally. They have to be published in English, but there are translators who are themselves translating into, as it were, American English, Australian English. It might be Bangladeshi English, it might be English from anywhere where English is spoken. On the whole, I don't think that's a concern, except that, coming back to the thing we were talking to Andrew about before, I suspect that that's one of the reasons why we have a problem about getting writing from the subcontinent translated into English, published in the UK, because there is a sense of it somehow being in the wrong kind of English. And that's a terrible thing to say, but I think there is still this sort of prejudice about different kinds of English being different, having sort of different levels of acceptability within the English language publishing centres in London and New York. So it's not so much an issue with this particular prize I'm judging, though as I say that's partly because there is very, very little translated from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan into English that's eligible for the prize. But I think it's an issue kind of earlier, as it were, earlier in the process.
Should we close it down there, I think, so that we can exit the stage? I'd like you to join me in thanking our panellists this afternoon.